Welcome to the Book Bites podcast, brought to you by Spines, where today we're biting into Two Connected Souls, written by Bruce K. Royer. It's a story about a father, a son, and what connects them across the boundary between life and death. And it's a book Bruce spent 15 years figuring out how to write. Bruce, most people give up their gym memberships by the second week of February. 15 years is a long time to stay with something. Any tips for writers or others on how you manage to stay at the desk?
Well, actually, Omri, what ended up happening is I wrote the book after the loss of my brother, and then there was a period after that of about 36 months what I had. What I would say is, personal calamity after calamity, which finally brought my Titanic business to its end. And when that occurred, I had nothing going on in my life, and ended up sitting in my basement office and just started pouring my heart and soul into this book for about a year. When it was done, it was almost like Jack Canfield's Chicken Soup for the Soul. It was soulful healing, and once that was completed, I left it on my desktop, and I went out and I started a new career.
Okay. Wow. So you sat on the book for a number of years.
12 years.
Wow. So the actual writing process took you 1 year, you said?
It was about a year it took me to finish it up. In between that, I was trying to, refine, rediscover myself. I was, in my 40s. My wife and I, we had just had newborn triplets,
Wow.
and they were 1 years old. I auctioned off what was the remainder of my business. Ran for 27 years, 4 days before their first birthday, and I had nothing. I was able to keep my wife and my kids in my house, and that was it. I lost everything else, and I just kind of sat down there, and it just started typing away. I copywrote it in 2014 and put it on the desktop, and I never really thought much about it. He told a few people about it here and there, but never really get into the actual process of considering that I was going to publish it.
And what were those reactions to those from those people who you told it to initially?
It was interesting because I had bought a tax franchise from one of those big organizations, and I had this one woman, and she was an editor, and she was really having a hard time financially. I said, "Look, I'll help you out to do your taxes, for a couple of bucks." And she said, "Is there any way I can pay you back?" And I was telling her, I said, "I wrote this book." She goes, "Well, let me edit it." So she took the book, and she read it, and she came back to me a few weeks later, and she said to me, it's so funny, she was walking in the office, she goes, "Look," she throws it down on my desk. She goes, "I'm going to tell you something." She goes, "I'm not saying this because you helped me out, but," she goes, "I do this stuff all the time. And when I get to the end of the book, halftime, I whip the book across the room." She goes, "Because the ending was horrible." She goes, "And your book didn't end up there." She said,
Wow.
"You need to publish this." And she goes, "And even if you don't use me," she goes, "would you please put my name somewhere in the book as a credit to, what I've done?" Which I thought was pretty interesting. That was the first interaction I ever had.
Wow. So that was the first person to read the book.
Yeah. Other than my wife, who, she sleeps with me, so she's going to tell me it's good no matter what.
That's a good wife right there. So you touched on loss as something that you experienced, and loss is also something that very much inspired this book. Do you want to talk maybe a little bit about the origins of this story and how it came to be?
How it came to be is my brother in 2010 was sick, ended up in hospice, and when we went there, he was too sick to communicate, but my wife was able to understand him. And she asked him at that time if he wanted to meet my son, and she said no. He said no. And so a week later, I'm in the next room giving my son a bottle as I notice he's looking up at the ceiling, waving and smiling at something and interacting with something that I obviously can't see. It's not there. And I was just looking at him going, "What are you looking at?" And he's only 13 months old. So he couldn't talk
Hmm.
or anything. He was just giggling and laughing and smiling. My brother died that night. And we had them come get him, and we packed everything up, and we came back to New Hampshire and went to bed. Then the next morning, I woke up to go check on him, and I grabbed the baby monitor and looked down at that monitor, and there is this bright yellow orb just sitting over my son's head, and it hung there for a solid 15 seconds or so, and then I just slowly watched it just drift off the screen and then disappear. And I knew that was him.
Wow. Wow.
So, and that kind of gave me the inspiration to sit there and write it, because based on what I feel and what I thought actually existed out there.
Had you ever thought of writing before, or this moment just brought that upon you?
It brought it upon me, and it was after that, as I had said, I had hit, like, it was one massive calamity that was involving personal and financial and business scenarios that just kept hitting me, like every month or 2 months, another one, another one, another one. It was like, just being a bowling pin and just getting hit by another ball coming down the alley over and over and over again until 36 months of it. And then the final pin went down, and I had just had enough. And I just threw it. I thought I was going to die. I thought I was going to die of a heart attack, and I just said to
Wow.
my wife, I said, I have to stop doing this.
And that's when the book, you said you kind of sat down and wrote the
Yeah.
book.
And then after it was all said and done, I'll never forget, the anxiety level was so bad that I couldn't control it. It was 24/7. It was going on for months. And when they had auctioned off my business and everything was gone, I remember walking into Verizon with my phone, and I looked at it and I said, "Hey," I said, "what will it take to change this phone number?" And everything else is gone. The emails were gone. The business line was gone. The fax line was gone. The only thing they had connecting me to the outside world was that phone. And they said, no, about 15 minutes. They changed that number, and I walked out of there, and the anxiety just was, the first time in months, almost a year, the anxiety was gone. And I just went home, went downstairs, had nothing to do in first time in 27 years, like literally nothing to do. I didn't have a phone call to make, a person to
Mm.
talk to. I didn't know what to do. And I sat there and I thought about the book that I had started, and I just got on there and just sat on the keyboard, and Two Connected Souls was born.
Wow. It's a beautiful title. Did you have any other alternative book titles that you played with before coming up with that one?
I did. I started out with, interesting you say that, because I started out with Disconnected Souls.
Oh.
And that was the original, yeah, that was the original book theme, was Disconnected Souls. And then what ended up happening is, and that was the title of the book all the way through, was Disconnected Souls. And then I get down to the very end of the book, and I don't want to give a spoiler alert, but the character that comes into play at the very, very end of the story, all of a sudden changed my mind. And I went, oh, that's
Mm.
just the wrong title. It's like, I've got to call this Two Connected Souls, because it kind of brings into the play, how the whole story comes together at the end. And I had no idea how I was going to finish it. It's literally,
Yeah.
I was writing it to the end, and I'm thinking to myself, I've got to wrap this thing up. And because there's so many different components going on and so many themes happening in the story, I was just trying to figure out how am I going to bring it all together and pull it all together. And then it just came to me one day, and I went, oh my God, now I know what to do. So,
Wow. There's a theory of writing that puts writers on a spectrum between architects and gardeners, whereas architects are those that plan everything out ahead of time and then execute their plan, and gardeners plant the various seeds, water them, and see where the stories take them. So, in this regard, without knowing an ending, do you think you fell more on the gardener spectrum of things, planting these seeds and
absolutely.
growing with them?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It was because I was going through so much personal loss. I mean, I've never held a job in my life since I was a teenager. I've always made my own money. And for the first time in my life, and I actually thought, it was funny, it was so naive of me. I actually thought that I was going to write this book and it was become a bestseller and blah, blah, blah.
Mm.
It was such
It
a
may yet.
delusional thinking, that, and I was just like, well, I wrote it, and like you say, when it was done, it was like you say, it was like soulful healing, and it just like took this load off my chest, and I was able to go out there and start functioning and interacting and going out and trying to figure out how am I going to reinvent myself and support my family. So that's what ended up happening. And the only reason why it came to be was my triplets were about 9 years old. They were having a hard time reading in school, and I sat there, reading books to them at night. And I said, "Look, Daddy wrote a book years ago." So I read a few chapters every single night. We're about three quarters through the book, and I'm like, come on, guys, close the book. I said, we got to go to bed. And I look around the room, and there's not a dry eye in the room. These
Wow.
kids would just sit there sobbing and sobbing. And I'm like, wow. I said, if these little kids can grasp the concept of this book and the meaning behind it, okay, and feel that emotional impact, I said, then maybe I do have something here.
Yeah. It's you
And
were
then it went
dealing
back on
with
the desktop for 4 more years.
well, dealing with loss is something that everyone does in a different way, and there's no one set path to do it. And it sounds like this book was a very important tool for you in kind of refiguring the next steps of your life. Would you say that this book kind of helped you move forward?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, if it wasn't for writing this book, I mean, I probably would have just sat there, and, cried in my bowl of cereal, and oh, woe is me, and, have a pity party all day long. And by writing this, like I say, when I literally poured my heart and soul, I mean, there were times where I sat there at that keyboard and I just sobbed as I wrote that story. And I
Wow.
sobbed and I sobbed, and I'd sit there and recompose myself, and I get back into it, and I keep typing again. And, it was all throughout the book, because I was literally pouring into my story, what I
Mm.
felt, things in my life, and the things that I was feeling. And when I get to the end of it, like I say, it was just like that breath of fresh air. It's like one time when I was younger, I had a breakup, and I remember this guy who was a counselor, he said, write her a letter. I said, why would I want to do that? He said, write her a letter. He says, tell her every single thing. And I said, then what do with it? What do I do with the letter? He said, anything you want, throw it out, burn it, this or that. He says, just write the letter. And I did. And I'll never forget, it was the best thing I ever did. I wrote that letter, and then it was all said and done. I sat there and said every single thing that was on my mind, everything I felt, this and that, to that person that was all said and done. I threw it away. And it was like, boom, I was able to move on and find another relationship, and find other people to sit there and interact with. Same thing with the book. I wrote that book, and it was like I was able to move on after that.
You, in the book, mention this concept and even the story that you mentioned before the book about your brother and the soul aspect. Is that something that you believed before writing this or before this experience?
Before him, oh yeah, I always felt that way. So he's not the first one. The first one, my 17-year-old brother, when I was 11 years old, burned to death in a fire.
Wow.
And yeah, we sat outside the house 10 days before Christmas, and watched our house burn to the ground. He never made it out. And I remember the dreams. I remember the vividness of that. And I remember my brother, my older brother, who they were very, very close. He told me of the dream he had with him. He told me the dream, how they went out and what they did all the time. They took his car, they went out, they went fishing, this and that, and they spent the whole day. He says, it was as real could be. He says, literally, he says, I was right there with him. He said, and then at the end of the day, he looked right at me and he said, we can't do this anymore.
Wow.
And my brother said, I know.
Wow.
I knew that was him, seeing him then. So I know they're there. I know they exist. I know they're around us. So, I know that they watch over us. After Brian died, my mother was 80, and he had a couple of trailers down in Florida. And obviously, my mother had taken him over because he was a single guy, and she was cleaning the awning on one of them. She was on a 6-foot ladder, 80-year-old woman cleaning the
Wow.
awning. She told me this afterwards, and the ladder kicked out, and she went boom right down on the deck, and she slammed herself. And she's telling me this months later. She goes, I didn't want to tell you, I was afraid you're going to be upset. She goes, but she goes, I did not have a scratch on me. She goes, I didn't
Wow.
have a bruise. I didn't have a bump. She goes, I didn't have to go to the hospital. She goes, there was nothing. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, that's a serious fall. If I fell off a 6-foot ladder, I know I'd be hurting, no matter what. And she was telling me that. And she goes, I know for a fact that he was there protecting me. And I'm like, there's probably so much truth to that you can't believe, because what are the odds of an 80-year-old woman falling off a 6-foot ladder and landing flat on her face? And she literally told me, she goes, I didn't have a scrape. I didn't have a bump, nothing. And I was like, that's incredible, because the odds of that happening are probably 0 to none.
Yeah.
So yeah, I do believe they exist. I believe they protect us. They're there for us. We just don't see them. We don't know, but I do believe they're
Hmm.
there.
It's very powerful. I mean, all the stories you're telling, it sounds like you've had to deal with a lot of adversity in your life, and the fact that you're able to write something so moving and move forward in spite of it all is an inspiring thing. So thank you for that. Not a question, but just thank you
Thank
for
you.
that. There's this image in the book, and you mentioned your triplets and how you were reading the story to them when they were 9, and it's really an 8-year-old book, an 8-year-old child with a cell phone using it to connect to another dimension. And it's a strange kind of mix of tech and spirituality. Was that inspired by the baby monitor incident that you had?
Um, yeah, I think it was I do believe the baby monitor played a role in it, because, as I was thinking about how to sit there and connect these two individuals, that had popped into my head when I was, reminiscing back into, what had occurred. The fact that that showed up, and my wife was so convinced that it was the sun, or it was a flash, or this or that was in the room. And I'm looking at it, it's like, it's 5 o'clock in the morning. The shades are closed. There's no light in the room. The room is dark. And it's like,
Mm-hmm.
and she wasn't wholeheartedly convinced, and I was, and which is interesting, because she's had her own experiences. When the triplets were born, we did in vitro, and she was so scared to death when we were doing it. And she remembers, because they put you under some sort of anesthesia, and she remembers clear as day when she went into that room, that she looked over at the chair and her grandmother was there,
Wow.
and she spoke to her, and she said, "Don't worry, it's going to be all right."
Wow.
So it's just interesting, because they're around you. You just don't know they're around you.
Sure. So is there any single thing that you really wish people would know, understand, or take away from reading your book or from hearing your story?
There's far more than what we understand and we know. And if you think that it exists, don't sell yourself short, because it does. There are souls out there, and they are connected to you. And if you actually pay attention, they're around you. They really are. This reason why things happen the way they do. And when you're paying attention, you can tell that they're there for you, and especially when there's times of loss. You know,
Mm.
that's when they're closest to you. But they never really leave you if you have that connection to them, if you have that that belief. So it's interesting. My mother loved butterflies, and it's so ironic, because my little girl loves butterflies, and that was their connection. And whenever there's something unique or something happening, and there's always a butterfly that pops up,
Wow.
always. And I started pointing it out to my wife, and and turning around, I'm like, "There's a butterfly again." And she just looks at it. She goes, "Yeah." And I said, "Remember what I told you? It's like, whenever something happens that it's about my mother, or some moment or something like that, a butterfly appears out of nowhere."
Wow.
And it's the strangest thing, and it happens all the time. So, I
Amazing.
mean, maybe she's a butterfly, maybe she sends a butterfly. Who knows? So, but there's always seems to be a butterfly where there shouldn't be a butterfly. So,
Wow. Wow. So maybe butterflies are signs from beyond for everyone as well. So keep an eye out for
could
them.
be. You never
I
know.
think,
But,
yeah. What's next for you, Bruce?
well, what I really want to do is, I want to see this book become a bestseller and turn it into a movie. And then I want to write the sequel. Yeah, I really do. But, I've got to take one step at a time. It's like anybody who does this or who's actually getting into this industry knows that there's no such thing as a bestseller overnight. So
Mm-hmm.
you've got to grow it, mature it, develop it.
Takes years of hard work to become an overnight success.
It does. So, and that's the ultimate goal. I mean, I think that it has the making. I think I think it's a really good story. I mean, I haven't had anybody come back and tell me that it's an okay story. And I've had a lot of interesting perspectives on it. Everyone from telling me that it's a great book to telling me that it's a hard read because it's emotional.
Mm-hmm.
It is very emotional. I had a customer the other day came in the office and he says, "Yeah, I read it." He says, "Thanks a lot." He says, "You cost me 2 boxes of Kleenex to get through it," which I
Wow.
thought was kind of interesting because he was a big burly guy. And to see this
Wow.
big burly guy tell me that it took him a couple boxes of Kleenex to be able to sit there and get through it, I thought that was kind of interesting perspective. So
Wow. Well, Bruce, thanks for joining us at Book Bites from Spines. You can find Two Connected Souls on Amazon. And also, if you want to hear extended interviews, some guests join us on Book Bites Deep Dive. So, until next time, follow Book Bites, leave us a review, and happy reading. Thanks again, Bruce.
thanks, Armory.